For over 2 weeks now, Turkey has been involved in an assault against the People's Protection Units, or YPG, in northern Syria. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan launched Operation Olive Branch to drive the Kurdish fighters out of Syria's Afrin district. Turkey has long considered the YPG to be terrorists and wants to secure a 30-kilometer buffer zone along its southern border. Both France and the United States have expressed concerns about the operation, which targets a group the U.S. has supported with arms, training and air support in the fight against ISIL. We begin our coverage with CGTN's Mikhail Bar-David in Istanbul. And Mikhail, before we get to the current operation, this is Olive Branch, what has been Turkey's involvement in the Syrian war so far?
Well, Anand, Turkey has been very involved since the beginning of the conflict. Turkey has been supporting the opposition part since the conflict began. Turkey has actually been fighting on the ground together with the Syrian rebels. They've been supporting them on the ground. Now, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan has also stated that there should be no future for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad for Syria. So that's a main stance for Turkey as well. Turkey has also been part of the Astana peace talks in Kazakhstan. Turkey is part of the 3 guarantor states together with Russia and Iran. Now, during the Astana peace talks, they've also established some de-escalation zones, and Turkey is also present in Syria because of these de-escalation zones with the Turkish troops in Syria as well. Now, Turkey has also been deeply affected by the Syrian conflict because of the spillover into Turkey. There have now been over 3 million Syrian refugees are now being hosted in Turkey. So Turkey definitely wants to have a say in the future of Syria because of this as well. Anand?
Right, let's look at this current operation, this offensive, Olive Branch. What is the objective of this mission for Turkish President Erdogan?
Now, Anand, first of all, Turkey wants to clear its border of the YPG Syrian Kurdish group. For Turkey, this group is perceived as a terrorist organization. Now, Turkey believes that it is a terrorist organization because of its affiliation with the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, which Turkey has been fighting with for decades now. So Turkey wants to clear its border area from the YPG, and it's important to understand that since 2015, the YPG has been able to capture a lot of areas along the border from ISIL in the fight against ISIL. So Turkey now says that the YPG is also a threat for Turkey along its border, and Turkey does not want to have a Kurdish autonomous state or a zone along its border. So it sees it as a security threat, as a national threat for Turkey, and that is why this Olive Branch operation was launched. Turkey says that it will continue until they clear the area in Afrin, and then they will continue on to Manbij as well. Anand?
Mikhail, the United States has about 2,000 troops in Manbij as part of the international coalition against ISIL. Does the Turkish government plan to send its forces into that region, and could we see a situation where U.S. forces could be facing Turkish forces?
Well, that's the main risk at the moment. Yes, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan has repeatedly himself stated that they will, in fact, move on to Manbij, and that's where it's going to get tricky, it's going to get complicated, very, very sensitive for these two allies. The United States is there present with about 2,000 U.S. troops. They are there actually supporting, training the YPG, the same group that Turkey sees as a terrorist organization, the United States sees as an ally in the fight against ISIL. And this has been a specific issue of conflict between the two NATO allies. Now, the United States says they will not withdraw the troops there present in Manbij, even if Turkey does move forward, and Turkey says it will indeed move forward. So yes, it is a very risky situation for the two. Actually, there was even a statement made by Turkish officials recently saying that if the U.S. troops are potentially wear YPG uniforms in that area, Turkish troops will not be able to make a distinction between the two, and they will be perceived as terrorists for Turkish troops as well, which would make it very, very dangerous for Turkey and for the U.S. allies as well.
Violent clashes between the Turkish military and Syrian Kurds are intensifying. Turkey launched a new offensive against U.S.-backed Kurdish troops stationed near the border 2 weeks ago. Heavy fighting is underway in the Kurdish-controlled city of Afrin. Fears are growing that the fighting will escalate and push east, where the U.S. has a military presence, even though Turkey is a NATO ally. It considers the Syrian Kurds terrorists. The group has been a key U.S. partner lately in the fight against ISIS. For more now, let's bring in James Jeffrey. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, Iraq, and Albania. James, thank you very much for joining us. I want to ask you first, though, to take us through the situation in northern Syria. What exactly sparked this latest conflict, and what's driving it?
Very briefly, The U.S., when it decided to get serious about fighting ISIS or Daesh, this terrorist group, found in Syria its best ally was an offshoot of the Turkish PKK terrorist movement, which is called the YPG. And it's with these forces that we have developed a strong anti-terrorist force in northeastern Syria that was fighting, as I said, ISIS, and is still fighting the remnants of ISIS. Turkey was very unhappy with this because it has been in a 40-year conflict with the PKK and sees, basically correctly, the YPG as the Syrian wing of this movement. However, Turkey understood how important fighting ISIS was to the U.S. It's also important to Turkey, so it allowed us to operate out of Turkey, out of bases in Turkey, even while complaining. Now the situation has shifted. The fight against ISIS is almost over, and the U.S. is signaling it wants to stay on in Syria for a long period of time against the will of the Syrian government, but we don't really accept the Syrian government of Assad, in order to ensure ISIS doesn't come back, but more importantly, as Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis have said, to exert pressure on the political process in Syria and diminish Iranian influence and interest in Syria. Good goals, the Turks buy it. What the Turks don't buy is our continuing the relationship long-term with this YPG. Thus, the Turks went into Afrin, where it is a particular threat to Turkey as it is nestled close to the Mediterranean ports of Turkey, and there's been attacks out of there. But more importantly, the U.S. Has never supported the YPG elements in Afrin. There are no U.S. forces there. The Russians were in there with them. And so the Turks are able to do this without an immediate conflict with the U.S. We'll see what will happen next, depending on how the fighting in Afrin continues.
And do you agree with the administration's approach of continuing to stay there and put the pressure on, hoping the political situation will change?
I do. The funny thing is the Turks do too. They just need to know what the limits of our support for the YPG, that is this Syrian Kurdish movement, is. The Turks fear that the YPG will exploit their relationship with us, basically to, in the long run, hurt Turkey. And the Turks don't know yet what our goals are long-term in Syria against Iran. And frankly, neither do the American people, the American Congress. And this has been an issue of contention with administration witnesses before Congress went on recess at the beginning of January.
James, when you look at this, it's hard to ignore the fact that the Turkish President Erdogan, is up for re-election next year. How do you think that's impacting his new offensive in Afrin and also along the Turkish-Syrian border?
Right. In fact, he might be up for election. He might move the elections forward to this summer. We don't know. It always has an effect because fighting this Kurdish movement, the PKK or the PYD, is a popular action in Turkey. Turks really, Turks of all stripes, including the very large Kurdish minority, in general, the Kurds are split, oppose this movement, so therefore what he's doing makes him look strong to the Turkish people, and it may be a reason why he'll move forward with the elections. Again, it depends on how successful he is in Afrin.
Do you think that the alliance between the U.S. and Turkey can potentially withstand this conflict? How do you see all this playing out?
First of all, it has withstood 3 years of U.S. close support and coordination with the PYD that led to the formation of a 30 to 40,000 strong force called the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are basically Kurdish-led. So it survived that. I think it will survive the Afrin thing because, again, there's no immediate American interest there. If the Turks miscalculate and decide to put pressure on the basic American presence with the Kurds to the east of the Euphrates and in an enclave in the west called Manbij, then there could be real trouble. But at this point, I don't see the Afrin operation causing real problems with the U.S.
James Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been Turkey's deadliest day since it launched an offensive against Kurdish militias inside northern Syria over 2 weeks ago. 5 soldiers died when a Turkish tank was hit by YPG militia, while 2 soldiers were killed elsewhere. Violence has escalated in northern Syria in recent days as Turkish forces target the city of Afrin and threaten to push further east towards the border with Iraq. Dozens of rockets have hit the Turkish border towns of Rehanli and Kilis, where a refugee camp is home to thousands of Syrians. There was heavy bombardment in Syria. Our homes and cars were destroyed. We escaped to Turkey, and now they're bombing here. We'll stay here until it's safe to return. The bombings have also targeted people's houses and public utilities in nearby villages. This is our land and we belong to it. Even if we have to live in a basement or on the street, we're not leaving. It's impossible to leave Afrin. Impossible. Meanwhile, in Paris, thousands of protesters marched to support Turkey's Kurds and protest the Turkish military incursion into Afrin. The demonstrators urge French and other Western authorities to take a tougher stand against Turkey.
عفرينا خواب پاریزن ملت خواب پاریزن ناهلن تک داگرکرک جی دولت ترک دربازی آخام به او آخایمه پیروز او قصد بخوین شهیداتی افغان ناهلن ولا دولت ترک دربازی به.
Russia has been working with Iran and Turkey on Syria. Tell us specifically about Turkey's involvement.
Actually, Turkey is being more and more involved in Syria day by day. We see here on the green zone the first involvement of Turkey against the Islamic State and the Kurdish militias at the time. And then we have these attacks in the last weeks. We see the green dots. These are the points of entry of the Turkish army against the Kurdish YPG. And we see here the deployment between the Kurdish YPG and rebel forces. And lately, we see that the Turkish army went all through Idlib up to South Aleppo. This is the first time that the Turkish army goes that far into Syrian territory. We heard many rumors days ago that the Russians targeted the Turkish convoy, which wasn't true at all, because we have to know that everything Turkey is doing in Syria, it's doing it with the okay of Russia, despite all the announcement and the political claims, etc., etc. They are advancing day by day with the okay of Russia, and all this was implemented with the Astana agreement, because actually Turkey is fixing the fronts by this deployment, because we see that Turks freezed the front of Aleppo from the north and the east, and now they are freezing it on the west. So this is what counts, and this is the de-escalation zone, and this way the Turks are containing all this rebel zone where there is jihadi activity. We have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which split from Al-Qaeda, but we also have new Al-Qaeda offshoots in this region which aren't connected to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
And what are the Turks doing south of Aleppo?
But actually, we saw the first images of the convoy this morning. What they are doing in south of Aleppo is they are creating, here are the images of the Turkish convoy, they are creating a buffer zone between the loyalist, the Syrian army, and the rebel groups and the jihadis on the other hand. This way they will have the upper hand. But we shouldn't forget there are many forces on the ground which don't like this. So Al-Qaeda offshoots don't like this Turkish involvement, but also Shia militias in the town of Al-Hadar, which is just in front of the town where the Turkish army is deployed, so south of Aleppo, and we saw that there are many frictions between Shia militias and the Turkish army in the last week. So there are many subversive forces on the ground, but on the political level, what is being implemented is what Moscow, Ankara, and Damascus, by the way, wants to be implemented, because Syrian forces took all the area east of the railroad, and what's left is a small area with jihadi factions, rebel factions, who are going to end up to fight each other under Russian and American bombs.
All right, thank you very much indeed for your analysis, Wasim.
Our top story for this half hour: Turkey has warned American soldiers in Syria of the possibility of being treated as terrorists if they keep backing Kurdish YPG militants. Talking to media, Deputy Prime Minister Bekir Bozdağ threatened to expand Ankara's operation to the town of Manbij and even east of the Euphrates River if the YPG did not withdraw. He went on to say that U.S. soldiers risk being caught up in clashes and the Turkish forces would not make a distinction if Americans appear in YPG uniforms. Bozdağ was referring to past images of U.S. troops in northern Syria with YPG insignia. Political commentator Jason Unruh joins us now from Niagara Falls, Ontario. Mr. Unruh, welcome to the program. What was your first impression when you heard I could say it is a threat coming from Ankara towards American soldiers in Afrin?
Honestly, my first impression was that the U.S. coalition against Syria may be starting to collapse. The problem is that the United States has collected a bunch of proxy forces together in order to do its bidding inside the country, rather than carrying out a regular conventional war against the government of Bashar al-Assad. Now, the problem is that a lot of these groups are fractured. They're all against each other. Some of them are on the same side, some are against. And it's hard to negotiate or to really navigate all those kinds of contradictions. Many of these different forces have different goals from each other, some of them in complete opposition to each other, as we've seen with the Kurds and with Turkey. So almost a situation like this was inevitable as the United States continued to support the side of the Kurds, which the Turkey sees as terrorists. It's naturally going to cause some antagonism with Turkey, with Ankara. So once they announced the creation of the SDF, a 30,000 unit strong, militia along the border between Syria and Turkey, it was obvious that Turkey was going to take exception to this and was going to have to do something about it, or they would see a renewed and even possibly even more bold attacks against the country coming from the Kurds. Now, this is the fault of the U.S. They have thrown too many different groups into the mix and manipulated them into doing their work for them. And eventually, this kind of problem was going to break out when you've got so many groups going against each other.
Well, Mr. Unruh, I think that it was pretty obvious as Daesh dwindled down in Syria, the issue of Kurds in northern Syria was going to be a very contentious one. We're now seeing the operations in Afrin. Also, Ankara has an eye on Manbij. Isolating down our focus on what's taking place in Afrin, what's the end game to all of this?
Well, the end game of all this, if the U.S. gets what it wants, is a Syria that has been balkanized into smaller pieces, particularly, hopefully, with the the north and the east cordoned off from the rest of the Syrian government, where particularly many of the energy resources are. The problem is that the force that they're using to do it with stands in absolute contradiction to the Ankara government. The U.S. is hoping to weaken Syria enough in order to be able to, as I said, balkanize it and to have it carved up into territories that it can control away from the power of the Syrian government. However, the problem is a lot of these groups do stand in opposition to each other, but how well this tactic will work out for the U.S. remains to be seen, because as of right now, with this problem between the Kurds and Turkey, it's not looking very good for them at all.
Haydi, busy.